That's a nice starting point, because one of the things I noticed when you were writing about your childhood and why you wrote it, your mother was a big influence.
Yeah.
You say, wasn't it? As well as and when you've gone to these eastern parts, yes, your wife's been with you, and you've said that very much a colleague as well as as well as your wife, kind of thing. Somebody that's helped you along as so.
Well, perhaps I should can say something about both of them.
Yeah.
Um, when Keith Thomas read some of the ethnographic volumes, that is the Oxford volume, for example, undergraduate, he commented that, reading my mother's letters to me made him realize how important she was in my intellectual development. And anyone who knows my life, and particularly Sarah, knows that that is true, that not only are we largely formed by the age of 5, but if we happen to have an outstanding parent as well as outstanding teachers, then that has a vast influence. And obviously the strongest is the mother. And to have a mother who, in many, many ways, was everything you could desire in a mother. She was extremely intelligent. Her younger brother was a Fellow of All Souls and Member of Parliament for Cambridge, Robert Rose James. But he always said, Iris, his older sister, is cleverer than I am. And all the family knew she was the cleverest of a clever bunch. So she was very clever. She's a good linguist. She learnt Gaelic, so that she made one of these standard translations of Gaelic folk stories, Mouth of the Night, which has been published. She learnt enough Assamese to write and publish a book of Assamese folk stories. I mean, as an example of her intelligence, when she was in her late 60s probably, or later, she decided to do an Open University course in philosophy and came to the exams, and she got a first. And then they discovered that she'd actually done the 3rd year by accident.
That's right. Yeah,
so I was wondered why she was doing Kant and Hegel and things in her first year in Open University degree, but she got her first on Kant and Hegel and the rest.
Amazing.
Then they sent her the first year or the second year, and it was so boringly simple that she gave up. She was a very good historian. She wrote a book which one of the leading historians of India, Percival Sphere, it was the first real expose of the black hole of Calcutta, called The Black Hole. And he thought it was a path-breaking book on the black hole of India. She was a very good poet. Many of her, or a number of her stories were broadcast on the BBC. She wrote 40 articles for the Scotsman, which I published as a book on the Hebrides. She was a philosopher, a poet, a mystic. She was a Buddhist. She, a Labour Party supporter, very, very keen on, and above all, she loved children and fantasy worlds. She lived in a world, of poetry and Gaelic folklore and all this sort of stuff, which obviously brushed off on me. The stories she wrote for me and the stories she read to me and the world she spun around me, as I saw her later doing with my daughter and others, was a world of dreams and mysteries, a sort of Yeatsian fantasy world. Now, to have that from birth for your first 5 years, and then to have a relationship in which gradually you turn from the little boy who she can hardly discipline and thinks is crazy and so on, and doesn't read and so on, just a little boy who begins, and then at 16 begins to like John Donne and Herbert and her favorite poets and so on. And then at 17, 18, then 19, 20, 21, turns from being as John Locke put it, from being a child to being a friend and a
Yeah.
colleague, and with similar interests. So our letters become intellectual exchanges, and having to write a letter a week, as I did at boarding school, and then continuing that tradition, um, has had a huge influence on my writing style. She was a very good stylist. She wrote simply and clearly, and really good writer. And so she had an influence at all sorts of levels, a spiritual level, a mental level, moral level. And to have this extraordinary person throughout your life,
Mm.
working with Sarah and I on various projects, historical projects and so on as well. I couldn't have been more fortunate in my mother, and also my father, who was a really lovely person, not an intellectual, but very, very supportive and strong and kind. So that's one huge influence. And then part of her undoubted abilities was the difficulty of sharing me.
Yeah.
When I had my first girlfriends at Oxford, she was always sort of writing from India and asking about them and showing no form of resentment or criticism of them. And that went on. And then when I formed the most important relationship of my life with Sarah, she encouraged it and supported it and took part in it, and worked with Sarah on editing Ralph Jocelyn's diary for a year. We worked together in Yorkshire and got to know each other very well. And they both had a great respect for the other, and they both had a love for me, which was not competitive. And that also, I mean, that could have been terribly, but it wasn't, because of two strong women who took me under their wing, so to speak. And then Sarah, I mean, I'd been married and quite happily married for a while to Jill, but Jill had her own path and wanted to go her own way. And I, being a workaholic, unable to separate my head and my heart, I always knew I needed to be with someone who would share my intellectual passions, because that is the passion of my life. And if they don't, then we're going to be on different paths and doing different things, and it'll drift apart. When I met Sarah, from almost the beginning, I discovered someone who shared this. She, as many women do, she gave up a certain amount of her own autonomy and separateness in order to work with me. And we have done that since. And we are like, the model early in my life was Beatrice and Sidney Webb. They referred to each other as the other one. I mean, they worked across a table, as Sarah and I do, and Sarah's opposite me now. So basically, you've got to have someone who, when you go on car drives, when you're in an idle moment, when you're going for a walk, you know, you're excited by what you're doing together, a joint project. And so our life has been a series of joint projects, and Sarah has been the main person in all of them, not just on overseas trips where she keeps the diaries and does a lot of much of the work, particularly in the field work in Nepal, but here in England, where she's typing in our various projects, and she was the manager of the big historical reconstruction project of Earl's Cone and of the Nagas and so on. So basically, 1 and 1 makes 10. It doesn't make just 2, because you complement each other's skills. She has a extraordinary ability. My mother was extraordinary writer and imaginative and so on, but like me, she wasn't a stickler for minutiae. You know, good enough was our motto. Sarah is a perfectionist in detail. And the nearest she reminds me of, I did the only really good interview of Fred Sanger, who lived in the next village to us. Fred Sanger, as your viewers will probably know, is at the time, he was the only living double Nobel laureate in the world. Won the Nobel Prize, twice for meticulous, incredibly difficult work of sequencing the first non-living and then the first living entity. And we won 2 Nobel Prizes in chemistry, biochemistry for that.
Yeah.
Sarah, if there were Nobel Prizes for historical reconstruction, would have won one, because the work she's done is as difficult as the work I think Sanger was doing. I remember we worked with a very, very good computer scientist at King's College who was our advisor, Ken Moody. And him on one occasion, we were working with the early big computers, the IBM 370 and so on. And as we walked past the building, this huge building with a vast computer in it of the 70s variety, and him saying, "Alan, be very careful of Sarah. Her brain is far more powerful than this thing here, and her ability to sort out these relationships in Earl's code is something that the computer will never probably be able to do." And treasure that ability. So Sarah, without Sarah, she reads all my books, she's improved a number of them hugely. She has a very logical, rational, very good memory. And so we complement each other. I'm more imaginative and wide-ranging, but she then grounds me and makes sure it's making sense. So this is something I really need to pay a huge tribute to.
Of course.